Good day, everyone. This is Robert Brown. I'm the director of the Bioeconomy Institute at Iowa State University. It's my pleasure today to host Dr. Daniel Sanchez in this program. Dan is a cooperative extension specialist, Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at the University of California-Berkley. Dan has written extensively in carbon capture and sequestration. I've cited his papers several times in the last couple of years, so it's been a real pleasure to have him join us today. Hi, Dan. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much for having me, Robert.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. So what we'll do is I'll provide some opening questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. They can set questions up in the chat. I'll try to read those to you as they come in. So my first question, it's simply to ask you, can you give us a little background about yourself and especially how you became involved in the area of carbon dioxide capture and sequestration?
Sure, absolutely. As Robert mentioned, I'm a faculty member at UC Berkeley, and I have a really great position there. I'm in cooperative extension, so I not only run a research lab, but I also have a mandate to do outreach and extension with policymakers and technology developers across the state of California. And the area that I research and that I work with policymakers on is how we can use biomass in order to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. As we'll get into, I think that's a really relevant question. And it's also pertains to the topic we're going to be discussing today, which is carbon capture and sequestration. Just to back up a little bit, I'm an engineer by training. I did my undergrad in chemical engineering, and I became really fascinated with understanding climate change mitigation and how we could develop new technologies that help us reduce CO2 emissions or reverse climate change itself. And so pursued that work primarily in the area of bioenergy during my graduate work, which was also at UC Berkeley, in a really amazing interdisciplinary program there called the Energy and Resources Group. And for the past decade or so, my research has really focused on the economics, technology, and the supportive policy for these advanced bioenergy systems that can help us remove CO2 from the air. I should say that I have read, digested, and also cited a lot of Dr. Brown's work over the years as well.
Thank you, Dan. I've seen a lot of confusion on why sequestration of carbon dioxide from a corn ethanol plant, for example, is fundamentally different from sequestering CO2 from a coal power plant. Can you explain these differences?
Sure. And this actually is really one of, I think, the core concepts that I know the Bioeconomy Institute at Iowa State is hoping to drive home. And that's really the difference between carbon reduction and carbon removal. Now, we put a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as a result of our industry and our industrial processes. Our cars put CO2 in the air when we burn gasoline. Our power plants put CO2 into the air when we burn coal or natural gas or other kinds of fossil fuels. And that CO2 goes into the atmosphere where it causes climate change. Now, we can use carbon capture and storage technologies. And let me define that really quickly. These are technologies that capture, compress, transport, and then reliably store carbon dioxide that would otherwise be emitted from an industrial process. This carbon capture and storage technology can be applied to fossil fuels. A power plant that is putting CO2 in the air can capture some portion of its CO2 emissions, compress them, and store them underground or store them in other forms of long-lived storage that are not in the atmosphere. This lets us reduce emissions, but it doesn't on net remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Now, when we do carbon capture on something like an ethanol plant or another process that converts biomass into energy, we're doing something different. Now, rather than digging fossilized carbon out of the ground and burning it to make energy, we're using a resource that recently pulled carbon out of the atmosphere. This biomass, as it is known, uses photosynthesis to fix CO2 from the air. If you are taking that biomass and then converting it and capturing some of its CO2 emissions, those CO2 emissions are not fossil in nature, but biogenic, as we call them. It's a scientific term. What that means is that if the process is designed correctly, the entire process itself can make energy while removing CO2 from the atmosphere on net. And so that means that when you compare the total amount of CO2 emissions that go into the air compared to the total amount of CO2 emissions that are removed and permanently stored from the air, that second number is larger. Thus, when we look at carbon capture and storage at something like an ethanol plant, it really does open up the pathway for these technologies to remove CO2 from the air rather than putting CO2 in the air.
And you and I had a side conversation about the effectiveness of carbon removal. Would you care to elaborate that, explain that to the audience, elaborate?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think from the atmosphere's perspective, right? When we're trying to solve global climate change here, a lower carbon fuel and carbon removal actually look pretty much the same right now. This is a world where we're still putting billions of tons, over 30 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere every single year. And so the net effect of reducing emissions and removing CO2 from the air looks the same to the global climate right now. What carbon removal allows to do, though, is to actually run climate change in reverse. We can create an economy that removes more CO2 from the air than it puts into the air. And that's something really unique about capturing CO2 from an ethanol plant or another biomass process. It allows us to get to that net atmospheric carbon removal. What that means is that we're running industrialization in reverse and reversing climate change. That only happens after we've minimized all other fossil CO2 emissions. And so there are some important distinctions here from a climatic perspective.
Dan, if I can take that a little bit further, is this because of the magnitude of, shall I call it, the spigot putting CO2 in the atmosphere versus the drain of removing carbon dioxide that makes this a big issue?
That's exactly right. We can think of, and Robert just alluded to this, we can kind of think of the atmosphere as a giant bathtub. Things go in there and they stay there for quite a while. The half-life of something like carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is likely centuries. So what that means is that as we put carbon into the atmosphere, that bathtub is filling up with more and more carbon. Now, natural processes, things like plant growth, things like reforestation, things like even CO2 uptake in the ocean, they do provide a little spigot that lets that carbon drain every year. What happens, though, is that the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere is much, much larger than the carbon that is pulled out every year through our natural sinks, through our forests and our oceans and our land. And so that means that carbon is accumulating into the atmosphere. And carbon removal, I think, needs to work alongside carbon reduction to really let us meet our the climate change mitigation goals, the really ambitious goals that we've set on an international level and that we've set on a national level in order to reduce climate change.
So it's a lot easier to release CO2 in the atmosphere than to pump it out of the atmosphere.
Absolutely. So just to give you a sense, if you mine coal or harvest biomass, that's about 50% carbon, and it's in solid form, right as it is. Now, if you burn that, as we do to generate steam to make electricity every single day all around the world, that carbon is released to the air as carbon dioxide. If you are trying to capture that from a power plant, you're talking about a concentration of CO2 in the gas that goes into the atmosphere at somewhere around 10%. So you've dropped from your 50% to your 10%. But then once you get into your atmosphere, you're actually at 0.04%, or 400 of every million particles that is in the atmosphere, roughly. And that's a very hard process to operate cost effectively. The chemical separation, as Dr. Brown might lecture in his mechanical engineering classes, is quite energy intensive and costly.
Well, in fact, I use my example is where's Waldo? So you got to find Waldo in a population of thousands and thousands of people, and to think picking him out is difficult. Well, actually removing him from the crowd is even more difficult.
I really like that.
So for those that are joining late, I welcome you to start posting questions for Dan, and I'll read them to him. But I've got a few more of my own, if you'll let me. So what are the challenges? Maybe I'm talking technical challenges to start with on sequestering carbon dioxide, whether from renewable fuels or fossil fuels.
Sure. This is a question that I get a lot, and it's one that I can happily report is mostly solved from a technical and from an engineering perspective. That is to say, is that the processes that we have for capturing and purifying CO2, for compressing CO2, for transporting CO2, whether in a truck or in a CO2 pipeline, and then storing that CO2 underground in a deep geologic formation, which is the most common way that we envision keeping it out of the atmosphere, essentially pumping it underground rather than pumping it into the air. Those are what we consider to be technologically mature processes. We have, for example, been capturing CO2 as a part of industrial processes, including things like when we drill for natural gas and try to produce natural gas that we use to heat our homes and power our furnaces and light our stoves. That is a process that typically involves separating that natural gas from CO2. There are processes all throughout the petrochemical industry where CO2 capture has been proven out. And the same thing holds for transporting CO2 and storing CO2 underground. We've been storing CO2 underground safely, and on purpose for probably about 50 years, mostly in the United States, actually mostly in West Texas and New Mexico, where we're storing that CO2 underground in active oil fields. But again, the technologies here have been proven out over several decades. And Robert, and one thing we can get into is that while the technology to do all of this has been relatively kind of technologically proven, the economic motivation or the reasons why you'd actually do this to make money have only just started to appear. So we're facing a bit of a paradox here. You know, we know how to use the technologies, but we haven't used it like this yet. And I think that creates some really exciting opportunities, but also opportunities for friction.
Well, in fact, one of the first questions coming up is, can you share more about the economics of CCS that you've been exploring? Let me try this. We're not here to pick winners and choosers today, but I did write a review paper on what I call thermochemical approaches to sequestering and capturing carbon. And I came across a paper of yours that I had to include, which basically said something like a corn ethanol plant actually has very favorable economics to, say, the gasification technologies that I'm got some expertise in. Could you explain why that is?
Yeah. This this really has to do with actually the same concept that we were talking about before, which is the amount of CO2 and the purity of that CO2 that is emitted from these different industrial processes. And that's really the largest driver of what we expect to be the cost of carbon capture and sequestration to be. So let me try to put a few numbers on this. When we talk about the cost of removing CO2 or storing CO2 or reducing CO2, we typically talk about a cost in dollars, or the amount of money you have to spend per unit of carbon that is removed or sequestered or taken out of the air. And it's typically $1 per ton of CO2. Now, a ton of CO2 is 2,000 pounds or 1,000 kilograms. It's a unit of weight. Most coal plants or natural gas plants or other plants that don't that are normal industrial processes, we would expect the cost of carbon capture, compression, transportation, and storage to be somewhere between $60 to $100 per ton of CO2, and that's because we're dealing with maybe 10% carbon in the flue gas and the waste gases. And we need to use costly solvents or costly solvents in order to do that chemical separation. It's even worse when we're talking about capturing CO2 directly from the air. There's an emerging suite of technologies called direct air capture machines that run exactly that Where's Waldo experiment that Dr. Brown was just talking about. Their estimated costs right now are about $600 per ton of CO2, We see a technological innovations on the horizon that might let us half that cost to about $300 per ton of CO2, but it's still relatively expensive. Now take that $300 per ton and divide it by 10. This is what happens when we produce renewable fuels from biomass, actually, whether through biochemical processes, things like making ethanol by feeding sugars to yeast, or by thermochemical processes that heat biomass up, remix the carbons, the hydrogens, and the oxygens using catalysts, and then give you a transportation fuel that you're looking for. Now, both of those processes produce pure CO2. Essentially, what is vented to the atmosphere is not 10% CO2, but it's just a mixture of CO2 and water. What that allows us to do is to avoid the costly carbon capture steps that are necessary to separate these dilute mixtures. So you don't need costly solvents, you don't need costly sorbents, you really just need pumps and compressors to take that CO2 to where it can be sequestered and put underground. We think that cost is as low as $30 per ton of CO2. So about half the cost when you're trying to be very favorable of fossil carbon capture and storage, and about a factor 10 lower than direct air capture and storage.
Well, that may explain why there are 3 such projects being considered in the state of Iowa. I wonder if you would be willing to comment on any of the logistical or technical issues associated with getting that CO2 underground.
Yeah, so there are over 200 biorefineries in the United States that process cornstarch. These are the starches that are in your ear of corn that you could eat, and feed them to yeast and produce ethanol. That ethanol is about 10% of our national transportation fuel supply per volume. And so it's a relatively large part of what we produce in the United States in order to power our vehicles and to move our light duty cars around the U.S. Now, the vast majority of those 200 or so odd biorefineries are concentrated in the upper Midwest, and I would include Iowa in there. I would include Minnesota, Wisconsin, other kind of Great Lakes and heartland states. There's a really great concentration of these low-cost CO2 capture opportunities in places like Iowa. Unfortunately, what Iowa doesn't seem to have is the geology that is necessary to store that CO2 underground. And so what I've spent some time thinking about, and what industry is now trying to build, are these long-distance CO2 pipelines that capture CO2 from things like Iowa's corn ethanol biorefineries and move them to where we can store the CO2 safely for centuries or millennia. Thus far, it seems like there's really 3 places that have emerged for where we can store the CO2. One of them is in North Dakota, particularly the central and western half of North Dakota, where we think there's really good geologic storage. A similarly really positive geologic storage opportunity exists in Illinois and in Indiana. There's another CO2 storage basin over there. And then the far western end of Nebraska also appears to have suitable geology for CO2 storage. And so we're seeing a number of project developers signing letters of intent with ethanol biorefineries, and in some cases, industrial facilities that are not ethanol biorefineries, saying that they will capture their CO2, compress it, put it in this pipeline, and move it to where it can be stored underground. There are profits and revenues that come from doing that, and both the pipeline operators and storage operators, as well as the ethanol plants themselves, will be sharing those profits.
Now, so the CO2 that is to be moved in pipelines, are we talking about gaseous CO2?
Yeah, so what actually happens here is we compress CO2 so much before we put it in these pipelines that it is indistinguishable between a liquid and a gas. It's known as a supercritical fluid, and it's a very high pressure operation. What that allows us to do is to move the CO2 relatively easily, and also make sure it can get all the way down the sequestration wells to where we want it to stay. And the sequestration wells are typically at least 1,000 meters deep, sometimes as much as 3,000 to 5,000 meters, really quite deep underground. That's where we're planning on injecting this, what's known as supercritical CO2, where it will be trapped underground and, again, hopefully stay for centuries or millennia.
Hard to distinguish between a gas and a liquid. Is that the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds?
It's a good question. You know, for putting the CO2 underground, it's the best of both worlds, but it certainly is not an easy scientific concept to explain.
Okay, I understood. Well, we've got some questions coming in. Alan Lintrup is asking, points out currently CCS is quite costly per ton. You just explained that to us. Can we expect that cost to drop dramatically, he asked, once the scale of CCS is greatly ramped up? In other words, are there some economies of scale that can help us out here?
Yeah, I do think there are economies of scale. I don't think we're going to see a lot of them in the ethanol industry. As I mentioned before, it's a relatively simple technology. You essentially need pumps and compressors, both of which you can buy from dozens of commercial vendors in the United States in order to take that pure CO2 and compress it to where it can be sequestered underground. Where we're talking about the $30 per ton CO2 capture, we're not going to see that much of a change. Where I think we are going to see innovation is in the CO2 separation processes that are going to be required for capturing CO2 from other industrial processes or directly from the air. I would say that, based on the science that I've seen, that we could expect maybe a 50% reduction at scale from both scaling up the systems that we already do have, as well as pursuing more radical innovations, things like new materials or new surfaces or new contactors that allow us to more efficiently capture CO2, but also more efficiently release that CO2 once it's bound, so that we can have that pure CO2 as a gas. And I think if you talk to folks who are looking at direct air capture technologies, they would likely argue that you can get more than a factor 2 cost reduction from these kinds of innovations.
Very good. Now, raising this issue of supercritical CO2 is generating a lot of questions here. So be prepared. So one question is, so what kind of temperatures and pressures are you talking about that exist with supercritical CO2?
Gosh.
Don't want to put you on the spot.
And I'm blanking a little bit, but I know that the pressure of supercritical CO2 typically exceeds 15 bar, or maybe it's 150 bar. And this is where I'm blanking, because I get some of my pressure units mixed up. But,
so we're talking atmospheres, right, of pressure. Equivalent. Right. Yeah. Okay. So very, very high pressure, although not very realistic for the industry. Industry works at those kind of pressures in all kinds of processes. So also related to this, so what happens to this supercritical CO2 underground? Anything, or it just sits there?
Well, it's a mixture of both. So what we're aiming to do when we put this CO2 underground is to trap it in a porous formation. So whether we think there's empty pore space, but also has several seals on top. So we drill a well, we put the CO2 underground, we seal it, then we expect it to stay within this empty pore space. Some of that CO2 just stays there and hangs out. Some of it actually reacts with the minerals that are underground and forms long-lived minerals, things like carbonates. Those are actually even more secure forms of storage, and typically on the order of thousands to tens of thousands of years rather than thousands of years. There are other processes like solubility trapping, where the CO2 dissolves in the brine, the kind of the very salty water that's underground, and then there are processes that essentially trap CO2 in kind of confined pore spaces. Kind of all these different things work together. The CO2 essentially, some of it stays, some of it gets trapped, some of it solubilizes, and some of it mineralizes. the end result is that we're really talking about a process that will hopefully keep the CO2 there for hundreds to thousands of years.
Okay. So it sounds like the thermodynamics of the CO2 going underground is very important. And I'm going to say, is that pretty well established science?
It is well established science, in part because we've been doing it for so long in the oil and gas industry. We're very good, especially in somewhere like the United States, in characterizing a reservoir, drilling a well, pulling up buoyant fluids, pushing down more things to pull up more buoyant fluids. And that's what we've really been doing for 50 years with carbon dioxide. What is typically done to stimulate an oil and gas well is water is injected downwards, and that allows more oil and gas to migrate to the surface. Now, as you know, oil and water don't mix, but CO2 and oil do mix. And so the oil and gas industry has gotten a lot of expertise in injecting CO2 underground as a way of bringing more oil and gas up. Now, that CO2 and oil is mixed, and they do separate the two and then re-put the CO2 back underground. So we can be confident that that CO2 is going to stay there if it's injected as part of an oil and gas operation, but it does move through the system several times before it does stay underground. And I think there are some important obviously, certainly to lay people, there are questions about, well, if the CO2 is coming back up or if the oil and gas is coming up, why doesn't the CO2 come back up? And the answer is that just some of it naturally stays down, given the processes that we already talked about when the CO2 is injected.
Carbon capture and sequestration isn't without controversy.
Sure.
And the question that's come up is, here in Iowa, there has been some pushback from farmers who do not support, as the question says, another pipeline being placed in the upper Midwest states. Is there any work occurring to optimize pipeline route and minimize farmland impacts? Or maybe you want to talk more generally about that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing at least two large multi-state CO2 pipeline networks being proposed and financed. And, especially in states like Iowa, there's a tremendous effort to do public impact or public consultation and public events around this and the counties around the state by both of these companies. One's called Summit Carbon Solutions and another one's called Navigator. The pushback that we've seen, comes in a couple of different forms. One has to do with concerns about CO2 transport and CO2 sequestration. Those are primarily safety concerns. Some of them have to do with, of course, concerns about pipelines and their the land use implications that those might bring up, whether it's through eminent domain, whether it's through going through land of particularly sensitive ecological value, or related issues like that. And then I would say there's a third bucket of objections that we're seeing, which is more concerned about fossil carbon capture and storage rather than biogenic or ethanol carbon capture and storage. And this is an argument that these pipelines that are being proposed, while they might be helping the ethanol industry, while they might be doing this kind of biogenic carbon capture and storage, the pipelines have said that they would be happy to contract with fossil fuel producers. They're already in discussions with things like ammonia plants where they make, or fertilizer plants where they're making fertilizer for our crops. Those give off CO2 as well. Coal-fired power plants exist throughout the region. And so I think a lot of people are concerned that these CO2 pipelines are going to ultimately provide a longer lifetime and what could be called a lifeline to these dirty fossil fuel power plants. Again, coal plants, natural gas plants, systems that, quite frankly, I think a lot of environmental campaigners would rather see sit down or would rather see shut down than cleaned up, or replaced with renewable energy rather than retrofit with carbon capture and storage. So I think it's really those three areas. Some of them can be answered and discussed using science. What happens to CO2 when there is a leak in a pipeline? How sure are we that CO2 stays underground once we put it there? Can we track it? Can we mitigate it if it starts to leak? Like, those questions can be answered scientifically. I think the other questions involve moral judgments and really complicated trade-offs about what kind of infrastructure do we want to have in the Midwest for decarbonization. What degree do we want to rely on renewable energy compared to carbon capture and storage, and which is a more promising climate technology for the United States?
Very good. Now, you mentioned safety briefly, and there is one question about the dangers of CO2 leaks, but I do want to clarify we're talking carbon dioxide, not carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide is very toxic versus carbon dioxide. Well, it represents some safety issues. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are related CO2 safety issues. One in pipelines and one in the storage formations themselves. The good news is that CO2 is lighter than air, and so it will go into the atmosphere if there is a rupture in a pipeline. That's relatively rare. It's not something that we'd be expecting, but pipelines do leak occasionally. The good news is that we're not going to have this pooling of CO2, at the ground in the event of a leakage. Now, with respect to the safety of geologic CO2 storage, again, we can rely on a lot of the experience of the oil and gas industry to understand how to track, monitor, and mitigate any of the risks that come. Typically, these formations where we're storing CO2 have a geologic footprint associated with them, and the regulations we've put in place in the United States provide for about 100 or to 50 to 100 years of what's known as post-closure monitoring. This is essentially the job of the person who is to put the CO2 underground to make sure that CO2 stays there and doesn't migrate and doesn't leak for 50 to 100 years. Again, this is while the solubility and the mineral trapping and all of the more permanent storage mechanisms take effect. I think that's going to provide a really good a really strong safeguard, probably one of the strongest in the world, from any concerns about CO2 leaking once it is put underground. I did see one question in the question and answer about seismic activity, and this is actually one of the only kind of remaining scientific uncertainties about putting CO2 underground. There have been concerns about microseismicity and other small-scale seismic impacts that come from putting CO2 underground in some areas. And this is something we've learned as we've been injecting more and more wastewater from fracking operations underground, including places like Oklahoma. There has been documented seismicity events from injecting that wastewater underground. And I think a lot of people are trying to understand if CO2 would have similar concerns. Now, keep in mind, these are very, very small earthquake events. We're talking about 0.1, magnitude on a Richter scale, and that's a logarithmic scale. So, a factor 100 lower than a 10. Or forgive me, even more than that. Forgive me. Factor several tens of thousand-fold smaller than a large-scale earthquake. But it is an area of remaining science and a place where I think we're still trying to figure out a little bit more.
So you said if it was a pipeline, a leakage, it dissipates. The concern would be a major disruption at a storage site. But what is this hazardous CO2?
Well, it's relatively low unless it's very concentrated. So what you'd need to have a hazardous leak of CO2 is if that CO2 leaks directly into a building that is not well ventilated, and the concentration of CO2 would rise up into a point that there is an impact for things like asphyxiation. That is a very hard scenario to envision, I would say, but it is a tail end risk. The CO2 at normal concentrations really doesn't pose, much of a health risk.
Very good. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here because they're so closely related. And the question here is it possible that this carbon sequestration would make could ever make corn ethanol carbon neutral? I would say even carbon negative. And in response to that, one of the questioners points out that, well, I'll point out that periodically there are reports that come out and say ethanol is worse than gasoline, and this week was no exception. There was a National Academy of Sciences report saying that it was 24% more carbon intensive than gasoline, and that's always related to indirect land use change, I believe. So can you kind of merge those two questions and respond as an expert in biofuels as well as in the carbon sequestration?
Yeah, let me say what I can. So, Robert, as you importantly note out, corn ethanol, as it's produced right now, is not a carbon neutral fuel. If you look over the entire life cycle, it takes fertilizer, and we use diesel powered machinery to grow it, harvest it, transport it. There are emissions that come from corn ethanol facilities themselves. You need heat in order to run the process to make ethanol from corn. And so corn ethanol, according to the numbers nationally done by the United States Environmental Protection Agency, as well as we've done similar numbers and studies in California, I think most people believe that gasoline or that corn ethanol is cleaner than gasoline on a life cycle basis, maybe about 20% cleaner. Now you need to get to 100% cleaner in order to be carbon neutral, or more than 100% cleaner in order to be carbon negative. But because of things like fertilizer, because of things like using grid electricity, that some of which is powered by coal, or using natural gas to provide the process heat for these facilities, again, you're only 20% cleaner, you're not 100% cleaner. There are further ways that we can decarbonize ethanol, and if you believe the numbers that are used nationally, you can get to zero or below zero. What that involves doing is essentially twofold. One is putting more and more renewable energy inputs into the corn ethanol. So that can include things like green ammonia. This is ammonia that isn't made from fossil fuels, but is made from renewable resources. You can use renewable electricity on the site to power the electricity needs there. You could use renewable natural gas, actually this gas that is derived from decaying biomass, rather than natural gas that is drilled out of the ground and combusted. And then finally, you can do more carbon capture and storage. These facilities, as I mentioned, they burn natural gas right now, and they do put CO2 into the atmosphere. So if you do all of those things together, the numbers look really quite good. You can get below zero for carbon intensity using a food-based biofuel. So I think that really shocks a lot of people, but it has to do with just decarbonizing the process as much as you possibly can. Now, there was a really good question, and I think in the Q&A, about a study that came out earlier this week that essentially re-estimated both the direct and I believe the indirect land use changes associated with the expansion of corn ethanol under the federal renewable fuel standard. And using, I believe, remote sensing techniques primarily, they argued that the numbers that are being used by the EPA or the state of California underestimate the land use change emissions associated with the corn ethanol expansion for the federal renewable fuel standard. I would say that we undoubtedly saw a good deal of land use change between, as corn ethanol ramped up. Some of that was due to an increase in corn prices as we demanded more and more corn. Some of it for ethanol. But there also were rises in other prices and demand for other fuels, including things like oil crops for other renewable fuels, increased soy demand and increased conversion to plant soybeans for both the protein and the oils that associated with it, and other food price spikes around the world. I haven't dove into that paper, but I think you'd have to be really careful about how you would attribute a land use change to corn ethanol compared to everything else that went on in that historical time series. So I would assume that's more of an upper bound estimate of the land use change emissions from corn ethanol. If that does hold, it is certainly concerning. We do need to make sure that as we think about how we use land to fight climate change, that we consider all the other different things we can do on that land. I see a question in the chat. Oh, could we just plant a forest on that farmland? People ask me very often, well, couldn't we make more energy by putting solar panels on that plot of land rather than growing corn to make ethanol to power our cars? And these are all important questions and trade-offs that we need to consider. If corn ethanol is significantly dirtier than we think, then we need to rethink how we use our land and how we use, particularly our food-based crops for energy or fuels.
And one of the questions that's come up is the question of how much impact could CCS do? So often you see it put in the terms of gigatons of carbon. We need technologies that can remove gigatons of CO2 from the atmosphere. Can you give us some idea what that could be, and maybe even compare it to the alternative of growing prairies and forest, as the question raises?
Yeah. So I think that carbon capture and storage writ large is a very large climate change mitigation opportunity, one that is likely on the scale of billions of tons of CO2 per year, or gigatons, as Robert mentioned. And as I mentioned, we're putting over 30 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere per year. So you have to think about several billion tons of carbon that is stored each year before you start having a sizable climate impact. From a geologic perspective, I am very confident that we have enough space in order to put billions of tons of CO2 underground. And I think that's a pretty well-established scientific conclusion. The size of the corn ethanol industry as it is right now and the amount of CO2 you can capture from it, it's about 50 million tons in the United States right now. So 50 million is 1/20th of a billion. And of course, a billion is not the full scale that we might need to fight climate change. And so we will need a larger bioeconomy industry if we are going to be pursuing billion-ton scale carbon removal. Now, 50 million tons is about 1% of U.S. transportation CO2 emissions. And so we do have a lot of CO2 that can be captured, including CO2 from other industrial processes, things like fertilizer, power plants, other kinds of renewable fuels productions, oil refineries. I mean, CCS is a really, really broadly applicable technology. So I do see it scaling up, but we undoubtedly need to step things up by about a factor 10 or more in the bioeconomy if we're going to see this scale to a very large solution.
And would you have it? Well, you've talked about a price of $30 a ton of CO2 for some of the least expensive. But in your mind, is there a price on carbon that, or should I say carbon dioxide, that would really move this technology forward?
I would be confident that if folks were willing to pay about $100 per ton, we could see a sizable deployment of biomass-based carbon dioxide removal. And I would expect us to see that in two places. One is in renewable fuels production, as Robert and I both work very closely on. We have a lot of incentives for low carbon transportation fuels in the United States, both state and federal policy. I won't go into it too deeply, but that gives a lot of revenues to these facilities, and these facilities do push off pure CO2 that can be captured at this low cost. The other market that I'm really seeing scale right now that is exciting is actually a biochar market. And this is primarily in the voluntary carbon market. We're seeing a lot of large climate motivated corporate actors, folks like Microsoft, who've been very public about their goal to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, stepping in and willing to buy voluntary offsets generated from the production of biochar. Now, this is a lower technology, it's not as technologically risky or cool as sexy as carbon capture and storage.
Oh, I think it is.
Good. But storing carbon in biochar, or what's essentially is charcoal, is it's centuries old technology.
It's low tech.
We think it provides not as durable of storage as storing CO2 underground in geology, but it can be durable enough to have a meaningful impact on the climate. And so I think those are the two markets we're going to see growing relatively soon. Over the next 3 to 4 years, we're going to likely see transportation fuels with carbon capture and storage in the United States, and we're going to likely see a modest-sized voluntary market for biochar.
Dan, thanks for that plug on biochar. We have enough time for one last question. I'm going to turn to Lisa Schulte-Moore, who comes back to the impact of these carbon dioxide pipelines on the farms. Do you have any idea what the impact of a CO2 pipeline versus an oil pipeline or natural gas pipeline on the farm corridor?
I don't have a volumetric comparison in mind, but we're talking about very, very similar pipelines and very similar sizes. Say you want to move 10 million tons of CO2, which is probably a large
Mhm.
portion of the amount of CO2 emitted by corn ethanol biorefineries, probably about the amount of CO2 that you'd be able to get from one pipeline that snakes between several of them. Um, I believe that that is about a 16-inch pipeline. So we're talking about a foot, we're adding a couple more inches to it. And it is going to be that 16-inch pipeline that is flowing along a right of way. So in that case, it's going to look very similar to above ground oil or gas pipeline. It's going to be thin rights of way. Hopefully, they're going to move along things like existing highways or transportation corridors, other existing pipelines, existing railways. I have not reviewed the plans for these Iowa pipelines in depth compared to the infrastructure that is there. But I do think that people are thinking about how to minimize its environmental and more, I think, equally importantly, its visual impact.
Well, we're out of time. I want to thank Dr. Sanchez for joining us today. We had lots of questions, didn't even get to all of them. Our next conversations about carbon will be March 23rd. Thanks very much, Dan, and thanks for everyone attending today.